Hello, and thank you for joining our session titled Telling Stories Using Planetary and Sustainable Development Data, a workshop for data creators and journalists to streamline the pipeline from data production to public awareness. We pre-recorded this session, but all of our speakers are answering your questions live in the Q&A box, so please do reach out. First, we'll hear from Sarah Schoenhart, the managing editor at Internews's Earth Journalism Network, about the importance of data literacy in journalism. Then we'll take you through the pipeline of data into journalism, starting with the introduction of the Listening to Leaders data by Samantha Custard from AidData. Then Anders Peterson, the director of Resource Watch, will introduce Resource Watch, a source for contextual data. Amelia Snyder, the data team lead on Resource Watch, will conclude with a demo on bringing these together for captivating storytelling. So great, Sarah, thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it off to you right now.
Thanks, Liz. I'm really glad to be here to share a little bit about the work we do at the Earth Journalism Network and to talk about some of the partnership that we have been developing with World Resource Watch, WRI and its Resource Watch platform. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up some slides to tell you a little bit more about our work here at EJN. So we started on our sort of data-driven and data work quite a long time ago, but I think I'll specifically talk a little bit more about some of the goals of this project. One of the things that we aim to do is help journalists better understand the value of using data in their reporting. So help them understand why data is worthwhile to integrate into reporting and storytelling. And then to help them bring it into their stories in a way that is both relevant and valuable to their audiences. And if you can see from this map, this is just the sort of broad expanse of the places where we work. So how do we do that? We do it through training and workshops where we teach journalists how to understand data and then how to bring that into their storytelling. We provide grants for journalists so that they have a little more flexibility to be able to devote time and resources to doing this kind of work. We also support media organizations. We have a series of investigative reports and special projects that we've built around a range of issues, but many of those are more and more integrating data into them. And then the other piece of that is geojournalism. And one of the things that we are quite proud of is our work with geojournalism. If you're not familiar with that, it's effectively the practice of telling stories with data that is generated by the earth sciences. And so what that means often is geotagging stories onto a map to provide a broader context and overview that brings some context to complex environmental issues. And we've helped develop a site, geojournalism.org, which I'll reference at the end of the presentation, that provides tools to help journalists produce multimedia stories using simple maps and data visualizations. So our data journalism initiative, which kicked off, as I said, a number of years ago, it started with us supporting data journalism in regions such as the Amazon. We have a project that looks at largely water issues around the Himalayas. We also have projects in Southern Africa, the Nile Basin, and Europe, where we've been supporting a data journalism initiative around wildlife trafficking, which is called WildEye. And then sort of to the heart of why we're here discussing data today, in August 2019, we partnered with WRI, their platform Resource Watch, to host an environmental data journalism workshop in Jakarta, Indonesia. And through that project, we then offered grants to a handful of reporters to go off and do individual reporting based on some of the tools they had learned through this workshop. We've also supported data journalism partners, such as the Indonesian Data Journalism Network, and we try and embed this into all of our mentorship, so the outreach and support we provide individually to journalists. And then lastly, we're currently building an online course that looks at zoonotic diseases and issues around those, and we're integrating this sort of data recipe, which is effectively a guide to help journalists through the steps they need to produce an environmental data story. So why does data matter? I think right now, as we all are very aware, media consumers are often overloaded with information. They don't necessarily know where to go to get the most trustworthy information. Often they find that the information being provided to them lacks context and relevance. And we do, increasingly worry about misinformation. So media consumers want reporting that is accountable, straightforward, and compelling. Now, how can data help with that? Obviously, data provides evidence and lends credibility to news stories. So effectively grounds reporting in facts, which is one way of helping combat misinformation. Another thing that we often talk about is how, especially data-driven reporting, can shed light on potential inequalities and gaps and help us sort of come up with hypotheses we can use to then investigate through our reporting. Furthermore, it makes abstract ideas more concrete. And if you are looking at data that has some future projections, such as issues around sea level rise, it can allow us to potentially look into the future and see where communities might stand in several years' time or further in the future. Datajournalism.com has a great handbook that talks about how data journalism can help journalists tell more complex stories by using engaging infographics, so it gets to the heart of the matter a little more quickly. And it also helps explain how a story relates to an individual. So again, back to this issue of relatability and relevance. And then finally, what's great about data is it can be the source of a story, so you can use it to inform the reporting you're doing, or it can actually help you come up with a story. So it helps drive the data forward, hence this idea of data-driven journalism. So what are some of the challenges? Often open data is still difficult to interpret. So it's great that we have a lot of access to data, but I think being able to interpret that, analyze it, and then integrate it in a way that allows you to create a format that tells a story is still a challenge for a lot of reporters. Some data is still hard to obtain. A lot of it isn't all open and publicly available. And we actually had one of our reporters recently messaged me. He's our content coordinator in Nepal. He put together a really interesting story looking at the most dangerous glacial lakes in the Himalayan region. It drew a lot of attention, but he said one of the real challenges with that was building trust with some of the researchers who provided the data. So really building rapport with data providers is something reporters also need to think about when data isn't always easily available. Something we came across or have come across quite a lot in our trainings, and I think is relevant to our work with WRI, is journalists often lack the skills needed to find, analyze, and visualize data. And this is a big, I should say, it's a heavy lift for journalists. Not only do they have to be able to find the data, they have to analyze it, they have to synthesize it, they have to find a way to package it so that their readers understand it as well. So there's a lot involved with data journalism that requires a significant amount of time and training and resources on the part of journalists and media outlets. Again, some newsrooms don't have the capacity to devote the time and resources to that. And there is no shortcut. Sometimes this really just does take time and investment. And that's something I think a lot of people aren't prepared for, that the idea of data journalism is very attractive, and a lot of people like to embed it into their proposals or their pitches for stories, but just throwing data into a story isn't the end of it. So again, data alone is not enough. The reporters need to collect it, analyze it, and then synthesize it. So really the data matters, but it takes reporting and context in order to give it meaning. So I wanted to share some lessons that we've learned from our work on this topic. We always try and monitor the impacts of the work that we do, and those can range from increased awareness, which is really valuable, to policy changes. And we can talk about some specific examples of some of the stories I'm going to point to later. Longer term training, as I mentioned, is needed. We are coming up with some data recipes and data help desks that we can use to reach out to reporters and help them sort of over the longer term once we've done some of these initial trainings. Mentoring and grants are also helpful to give reporters some space to be able to do this kind of work, and working with data scientists. As I mentioned earlier, researchers, journalists, and data scientists often work in silos, and I think having a cooperation between them helps create a more comprehensive story. Some of the media outlets we worked with on our Indonesia project, we found that the collaboration worked best when it started from the very beginning. So as reporters were sort of conceiving the story, idea, and design, rather than just at the end when they needed to engage data folks to help with their stories. And then relevance matters and personalization, but not at the cost of data. And so I bring that, oops, sorry about that. So I bring this up because there's been some really interesting work done on this, I think, particularly by the New York Times. They've tried to do a lot of personalization through stories like one called "How Much Hotter is Your Hometown Than When You Were Born?" And you can actually go and input your hometown, the year you were born, and it'll give you sort of a baseline of what the temperature was that year, and then look forward to current day, and then even project further into the future in a decade or 2 decades to come. And a challenge with that, of course, is that on the one hand, it puts readers directly into a story, which is great, but a lot of hyper-local data or very local data isn't always available. And so these are sort of extrapolations. And so reporters need to be careful about knowing where their data comes from, how much of it is actually available, what it all means, and making sure that they're not losing some of that when they try to make data too relevant to their readers. Obviously data that shows something very concrete is hugely valuable. And I have an image here of a project ProPublica did around the Louisiana, the New Orleans basin, that looks at sea level rise and how the coastal areas will change and how they have changed over time. So that's a very concrete way of showing sea level rise is happening. And then they use that to draw some deeper reporting around the impacts of that. As to the rise of data visualization, larger media outlets in more Western countries have started investing in data journalism and have been doing this for some time. I think in part that's because they recognize the value and the potential of it, both for building their audiences and thereby their revenue, but they also see that they've had better access to sort of open data and digitalization of information. We are seeing that happen more in the countries where we work, particularly in Asia. They're starting to pay more attention to data journalism and putting the resources in. We found that a couple of our partners, the Indonesian Data Journalism Network, is pushing a collaboration between programmers, data scientists, and journalists, which is really nice to see. But I think there does need to be more of that. And lastly, some examples. This is a project we worked on, and these are all quite interactive stories, so they don't look as great in a flat format, but this is a project that we worked on through our Info Amazonia project called Digging into the Mining Arc. And it's a long-form story that really visualizes some of the impacts of mining on the surrounding communities. And this little map over here is looking at indigenous lands and how a projected mine site will overlap with those. So it gives a much more human element to some of the stories that often seem quite removed from the social impacts of the things that we're reporting on. This is a group that we work with called Oxpeckers, and they have done a couple of really interesting projects in Southern Africa region. The first one is called Climate Tracker, which basically maps the climate impacts on different parts of that region. And the bottom one is their work on wildlife, which compiles data and then tracks and maps the different types of wildlife investigations that are going on around it. So for example, it'll look at seizures of particular wildlife products and then follow up with information about different judicial implications for that, whether there's a court case that's being followed up or whether people are being prosecuted. So it's an interesting way of bringing data into a topic like wildlife trafficking that can sometimes be very complex, and not all the data is found in one place. They've really put a lot of effort into bringing this data together, making it easily accessible for journalists to use in their own reporting. These are a couple of infographics I pulled from the New York Times because I think they've done a lot of good work on data journalism and bringing it into their reporting. The top one is just a way of showing how different measures to curb emissions could be effective. And so this first picture looks at the current trends and then how different interventions might make a difference over time. And then the bottom graphs are from a more recent story looking at climate migration or migration driven by climate change. And it shows things like sea level rise and number of communities that will be displaced. And I think these kinds of visualizations that bring in data and show people really very visually what areas of the country will be affected, whether they're someplace that they know or live, and just how deeply those effects will be, are great ways of bringing a human element into all of these stories. And I'll come back to this at the end because I think this is a great story to visualize online, where you can get into some of the interactive nature of it. But this is a media organization we worked with as part of our project with WRI that looks at forest and land use fires and the impacts of those. And what's interesting is they looked at so many different aspects of the data, but rather than just looking, for example, at how many trees were burned in a particular year, they've also looked at the social effects of that. And I think this again gets to the heart of the human story behind a lot of these environmental issues, that you can see more trees actually burned in 2015, but the social impacts in many ways were much greater due to number of sort of human casualties and other losses that resulted from these fires. So this is a great way of showing all sort of aspects of environmental degradation and damage that are occurring in a way that I think brings these issues and the data behind them home to readers. And then this is a list of resources, obviously our website and information about our data journalism project. Internews, our parent organization, also has a project focusing on data journalism and how to work better with journalists to help inform them, how they can integrate that into their reporting. The Oxpecker site has different climate trackers and other trackers you can follow, and then our geojournalism.org.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We'll continue working towards bringing those researchers, journalists, and data scientists out of their silos with a presentation from Samantha, the Director of Policy Analysis at AidData next. So take it away, Samantha.
Great. Thank you so much for the chance to join you today. I just want to make sure that my screen is working just fine. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, for the chance to join you today for this important conversation about how to use data to spark conversations with policymakers, the press, and the public. This topic is near and dear to my heart because I consider myself to be not only a producer and user of data, but I also study why people do or do not use data. So this is a fascinating discussion, for sure. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I work for a research lab called AidData at William & Mary. As a lab, we produce a wide variety of data and research, but I like to say that what ties all of this together is that they all ultimately seek to answer a single question: who is funding what, where, and to what effect around the world? In our work, we aim to have one foot in academia and one foot in the policy world. Why, you may ask? We serve as something of an information broker, you could say. bringing the best methods from the ivory tower to applied research questions that are timely and relevant in the real world. In today's brief time together, I wanted to walk you through 6 key lessons that I and AidData have internalized over the years in how we and you can start conversations with the press, policymakers, and the public. And this has been trial and error, to be sure. And so to make this as concrete as possible, I thought I would share these insights through the context of one particular project that I oversee called the Listening to Leaders Survey. So I should probably first briefly give you a sense of what this survey is before I dive into these 6 key lessons. So every 2 years, AidData fields an online survey to leaders from 126 low and middle income countries. And we ask them to weigh in with their insights on a battery of questions. The respondents to our survey come from 5 different stakeholder groups: government officials, civil society representatives, private sector leaders, independent experts from the media and academia, as well as the local representatives from development partners. We fielded the first wave of the survey in 2014 and the second in 2017. Today I'll be sharing some highlights from the 2017 survey, but a point of note is that we just wrapped up the 3rd wave of our survey for 2020 last month, and we'll be coming out with some new findings to share in the beginning of next year. So with that, I wanted to pivot a little bit now into 6 kind of trial and error, hard learned, lessons learned of how do you actually make sure your data doesn't end up in a graveyard and actually makes it into the public discourse. So the first insight I'd share is that your target audiences seldom begin with the data. It's about choosing the right questions. Several years ago, I did a survey of users of governance data, and 46% of them said the primary reason why they chose to use data set or not, that they thought it was relevant to the questions that they were trying to answer. So they weren't starting with the data, they were starting with the question and then going to the data that made sense. And so, you know, I guess the lesson for that, for those of you that are data producers, is that you need to get out of the building to find the right questions. I, as an academic, have lots of questions that I'm interested in, but they may or may not connect with what Sarah is interested in from a journalist perspective, or what a policymaker cares about. And so that's why you need to get out of the building, or at least get on a Zoom call with somebody else somewhere else in the world. And so in the Listening to Leaders survey, one of the reports that we did, we kind of took this to heart to ask 3 timely questions that we kept hearing about in a lot of the meetings and conversations we were having. So the first is about performance. Which international donors do leaders see as their preferred development partners, and why? Priorities. Do leaders, citizens, and donors agree on what they think are the most important problems to solve? And then progress. Whose support and what conditions make leaders more or less optimistic about their reform efforts? So the second insight I wanted to share is that in a crowded marketplace, and Sarah alluded to this earlier, there's this information overload. You need to bring something novel to the table. Again, you know, I do a lot of surveys of leaders around the world and asking them about why they use data or not. And one of the common trends that we see is that data producers miss the mark when they fail to offer new insights. It's just seen as something that they've already heard in another format or another forum, and it just kind of, it moves right on by. And so the challenge here is novelty. And so, you know, with the Listening to Leaders survey, I think the novel thing is that we essentially flipped the script on development effectiveness. So if you think about most ways in which we think about evaluating development effectiveness, we go to the experts, right? We go to the arm's length evaluations. We ask the experts whether or not they think development is working. But how often do we actually ask the people who we are seeking to influence and support, which are leaders in low and middle income countries? And so essentially we aim to solve that data gap by going and asking these leaders themselves what were their experiences working with their development partners. And so as you can see on the screen here, this figure, essentially we gave these leaders the opportunity to assess their development partners in 2 dimensions. One is, how influential were they in shaping development priorities in their country, so what leaders choose to focus on, and then how helpful were they in translating ideas of policies that could be pursued into actual implementation on the ground. And this was quite controversial and exciting, and you know, sparked quite a lot of debate within the development community because it was unique. No one had done this before. And so you can see that leaders actually found quite a varying degree of influence and helpfulness for different donors around the world. The second thing that I think was unique about the Listening to Leaders survey was that we, rather than assume that development experts knew what the priorities should be, we actually asked leaders what they thought the priorities should be for development in their countries. And we used the Sustainable Development Goals as kind of a common lexicon for that. And what you see here are the results of that question that we posed to leaders. And we clearly saw that leaders consider education, institutions, and jobs to be their top priorities. But what's interesting is that when you look at where donors are placing their financing, donors don't always align with what the leaders want. And actually, it turns out we are under investing in education relative to the high demand and premium that leaders put on this. The third insight that I wanted to share with you is the importance of producing data with the end users in mind. If you wait until dissemination, you've missed the boat. And I think Sarah alluded to this as well. You can see here on the left a figure from a survey that I previously ran, asking potential users of data, both from the press as well as from policymakers, about what information providers or data providers could have done better to make their information more useful. And all four of these reasons, I would argue, reflect the importance of engaging end users. So involving local stakeholders in actually producing data, not just disseminating it, providing actionable or concrete recommendations. Who knows that better than people that are on the ground closer to the topic at hand? They align with the needs of relevant stakeholders, and they reflect the local context. Sorry, let me just go back one thing there. And so what I will say in terms of the Listening to Leaders survey, we have internalized that. So we, with the last wave of the survey, began actually consulting with some end users on the research questions for each new report we take on, in the design of the questionnaire, to say, okay, you know, what are the questions that you would be most interested in having the answers to? And then actually sharing works in progress with key representatives from different stakeholder groups, get their feedback. We found that, you know, a journalist or a policy advocate will read the same paper very differently than an academic, and that's useful feedback for us. The fourth insight that I wanted to share is that it's not dog that bites man, but man that bites dog that makes for a good story. And this is something that a colleague of mine, who's our primary media liaison, always likes to say. This is really important for data producers and researchers to take on board, because we're naturally enthralled with data. We can get lost in the weeds of data ad nauseum. Everything is interesting to us. But the challenge for journalists and for policymakers is they're looking for something unexpected. They're looking for something that surprises them, that kind of gives them some new insight that they haven't thought about before. And so that means that for researchers and data producers, we need to do more than just disclose the data or post the data. We need to also think about getting the framing right, and that is important. So how do you highlight or elevate the things that are most important and most interesting and surprising to your end user? And so I'll give you some examples of that in the context of the Listening to Leaders survey. I mentioned earlier that we gave the opportunity for leaders around the world to assess the influence and the helpfulness of their development partners. And they were able to do that in 2017 and 2014. Now, if you looked at the data itself, you know, for each year, you would say, well, you know, a lot of the usual suspects float to the top. The longest standing donors, like all of the multilateral organizations like the UN and the World Bank, they always do very well. The largest donors, the most wealthy donors like the US, tend to also do well in absolute terms. But if you look at the progress over time and the change over time, it's important not to just look at a static snapshot of, you know, how these donors are doing in a given year, but it's also looking at the trajectory over time. What's happening? What movement is happening between all of these different donors as they're seeking to influence and provide support to low and middle income countries. And perhaps what is most interesting, I think, here is that when you look at this movement over time, it's some of the emerging donors like China and India that are actually rapidly rising to the top in terms of, you know, getting the award for most improved in the eyes of their partners on the ground in countries around the world. The second thing that I'll also say as an interesting angle is when you see that rhetoric is out of alignment with action. And so what we did here is actually on two different axes, we plotted all of the leader priorities using our Listening to Leaders survey, and then we compared that against the results of a My World survey of citizens. Basically, both groups of people were asked about what are the most important pressing problems for your countries to solve. There are definitely areas where citizens and leaders are in agreement. One of the sad things for those that are advocating for climate change, climate action, and the environment is that leaders, citizens, and donors are in agreement about their relative deprioritization of climate action, which is kind of a huge wake-up call in light of the fact that you can't always buy the storylines of the big public pronouncements, the news conferences, and the financial commitments to these things if you actually ask people what their priorities really are. The fifth insight to share is the importance of being transparent to increase credibility with end users. And I think Sarah also alluded to this fact that it's very easy to get overwhelmed with information. It's important to know what's trustworthy, what's dependable and credible to incorporate in news reporting. We find that answer as well when we ask users of data what they think is most important. And we actually found out that users of data often will point to the lack of credibility as one of the most important things that stops them from using a data set or a research product. And when we dug into that a little bit deeper, we asked, well, what makes something lack credibility? And a lot of it came out to be the fact that there was lack of transparency, not just about the data, but about the methods to collect the data, to synthesize it, to analyze it, and any assumptions about the data that would be important to understanding the context for potential skews or biases that might exist. And so, you know, for that reason, you know, AidData made an effort to document as much as possible you know, our survey data. So we include at the end of every report a pretty in-depth appendix that lays bare for the world to critique how we constructed our sampling frame, who responded to our survey, how we constructed these rankings. And essentially people may or may not agree with our findings, but they have the chance to actually look at how we produce these things. And secondly, we also make the data set publicly available with appropriate metadata and documentation so that others can use this too. And I think actually you'll get to see an example of this reuse and replication later in today's session. And then the final insight that I wanted to share with you, and this really kind of brings home the, you know, towards the ultimate objective of the pipeline, is to get a megaphone to share your data and to spark conversation. I think this requires being willing to engage beyond the boundaries of your data and be responsive to inbound requests. I think Sarah mentioned that a lot of newsrooms around the world, journalists are strapped in terms of they often lack capacity or time to be able to go find data sources or mine data sources or figure out how to interpret and manipulate these data sources effectively in the context of a journal article or in the context of a news article. And so that places additional burden on the data producer then to say, we're going to make that investment of time and effort to do that well. And so I'll share two examples of that in practice using the Listening to Leaders survey. I mentioned earlier that we had this opportunity to look at ratings of different development partners and then compare that over time. You can see we had a partnership with the South China Morning Post along these lines that actually involved a pretty extensive amount of preparatory work on our part where we were sharing slide decks of all of the data that we had, extensive back and forth with their news team and our data team to try to explain, how the data was produced and how it was sourced and how it could or could not be interpreted. But obviously the South China Morning Post gets a much wider megaphone than we do as a data producer. But also importantly, they can connect it into a contemporary debate that's going on in terms of trying to understand China's influence as a development partner. And then my personal favorite, which I think is kind of a nice segue to the rest of today's session, is this example that I shared earlier about the relative priorities that leaders have when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals. So we had a collaboration with the National Public Radio Goats and Soda blog, which was very interested in trying to understand, what's significant about this idea of having leaders weigh in on their priorities. I gave them an interview and I talked about actually, and this is a good example of framing. They asked me what was one of the most surprising things I discovered from the survey, and I talked about this consensus around the relative lack of importance of climate action is kind of the big takeaway. And they went with that and they did extensive investigative journalism, talking to environmental groups, talking to policymakers, kind of doing interviews with them to provide this context, drawing in some environmental data, and then using our data as well. And what you can see on the right-hand side, similar to what Sarah said, this is a static visual, not the actual interactive, but we worked with them to develop a widget that they could embed on their site and that allowed people to toggle and see different views of the data. So they could go and play and look for their region or look by goal and that could connect back to our website. Once again, a much wider megaphone than what we could do, but then also importantly, they provided context so that this data point didn't just fly by in the midst of a report, but they kind of situated it in a story. So with that in mind, I hope that those 6 lessons are useful to you. We are still learning, and I hope that we can learn from you and from your questions as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you for bringing out some of the challenges and successes of sharing your data. So next we'll hear from Anders, who will present Resource Watch, which is an online catalog of over 300 data sets where you can really access that trusted data that has clear methodology. So go ahead and take it away, Anders.
Thanks very much, Liz. And I wanted to check that you see my slides well. Mm-hmm. Great. So I'm gonna share some information about Resource Watch, which is WRI's institutional data platform, and how it can be used by journalists. I first of all wanted just to thank my colleague Lisa Kosha for having put this session together. It's been a tremendous amount of work, but it is so exciting to be able to meet despite the social distancing and the travel restrictions we have. So huge thanks to Liz for putting it together, and I hope we will get some good discussion in the chat. So Resource Watch was, and I'm going to speak for roughly 15 minutes, and then my colleague Amelia Snyder will jump in with a demo of the platform itself. So Resource Watch was launched a little more than 2 years ago in 2018. And it was launched really with the ambition at WRI to think about how do we think about data in a joined up way across the sectors and areas. WRI has a rich history of working and developing data platforms. Some of you may know our Aqueduct platform for water data, or our Global Forest Watch site, which is our flagship platform for everything related to forestry. But Resource Watch was really created with the ambition of a joined up approach. So how do we think not only about water challenges, but also water challenges that intersects with governance issues? And so that's really the aspiration that we approach this with, and we're excited about how far we've come. Because users, what we found is users don't only need data. They need data curation. They need transparency about how data has been created. They need a high degree of vetting and review to make sure that the data sources are credible. So Sam has already brought up some of these issues in her presentation, and we are echoing many of the same experiences that not only decision makers, but also journalists are looking not just for a dump of all the data that's out there, but really for someone to help curate and review. So these are some of the areas that we cover at Resource Watch. We are focusing on geospatial data, but we also include economic data and other contextual data that can help shape understandings of human development, environmental sustainability, and planetary health. And we're now at an interesting, we're now at a really strong point of having more than 300 data sets across all these domains, and with more than 50 of those being in near real time. So that means we have flooding data or hazard data, fire data coming in a regular stream on a day-by-day or week-by-week basis. And so that means that journalists covering issues on the ground can really get very timely and updated data. How do we select what we then publish? How do we select what's the right things to bring out there? We, as many of you on the call, care deeply about data being openly available. It's not enough to visualize data if you can't provide the raw data as well. You need to have the level of transparency that others can review your raw data, do other things with the data if they want to. So having open data is important. It's not enough to just put data on a map. You gotta have the full download needs to be available. We believe that relevant data and thinking carefully about curation, that really matters. So WRI, we harness the vast network of more than 1,000 staff across WRI, across 50 countries, but also we're harnessing the wide partner network that Resource Watch has. We care deeply about methodologies and that data can be verified. So not only does it need to be, it's not enough that you have the raw data, you need to know that there's a credible methodology behind it. So whether that's a peer-reviewed article or whether that's a government that issues a very detailed documentation of how they've collected the data, that is a review process that we take very seriously because we believe that that users demand that, and that trust is a critical currency. And as I mentioned, on near real time, we absolutely care deeply about providing a lot of near real time data as well. So the Resource Watch partnership has, here 2 years in, really brought a number of different partners together. We are working with everyone from academic institutions, data providers, we're working with companies, we're working with technology experts. So we're really working with a vast group of people, and in some cases we work on convening. In some cases we work on getting to a specific audience. That could, for example, be the North American Association of Environmental Educators. We work with them to get to more educators. So we will work with a number of partners in order to get out as widely as possible, in order to bring the best data onto the site, and in order to harness the technology in the best way possible. So Amelia will provide a more detailed demo shortly, but I wanted to give a quick sense of what do we think about when, as Liz mentioned, when we think about bringing context to data. And a key tool that we're working on is a key feature that we provide is really providing the overlays between various data sets. We believe it's not only enough to show, for example, population density. We think if you can bring population density and then projected sea level rise together, then you can actually see and visualize some really important impacts. And Resource Watch, we're not the end all be all to that. We believe that reporting by journalists, narrative reporting, should supplement that, and that's why we've worked with, for example, Earth Internews and Earth Journalism Network to bring the human side of that story, bring narrative stories together with the data that we have here. But we believe that we need to bring various data sets together in order to tell powerful stories and support powerful storytelling. Here's an example from bringing water and conflict data together. We have water stress data from our aqueduct portal at WRI, but thinking about how water stress might connect to governance challenges on the ground and social unrest, that's actually a problem that not only journalists but also security experts and humanitarian professionals care deeply about. And it happens to be that the ACLED conflict dataset, which is a well-renowned dataset on social unrest, can provide some really interesting insights in how water stress and social conflict intersect. Again, the visualizations will not tell the full story. You'll need to mine the data, you'll need to be on the ground, but it can provide a really important eye-opener for decision makers, for journalists, in order to understand that there is a connection. And on energy and air quality, we know by intuition that coal-fired power plants are not good to our health. We've had decades of regulations that have tried to curb coal-fired power plant emissions for that reason. But in fact, we can tell powerful stories by putting these things together. How does air quality look like around coal-fired power plants? This is an example from India that shows that there's indeed a connection between them. So I'm going to share a couple of use cases and examples of how Resource Watch is being used, and then we'll jump to Amelia's demo. So in South Africa, we're working with an NGO called the Gorris Cluster Biosphere Reserve on supporting local mapping on the ground of conservation issues in the reserve. They have a number of different types of vegetation. They care deeply about biodiversity, and Resource Watch can help provide near real-time data on occurring fires in the neighborhood, in the area, and we can help the organization think about risk management in terms of understanding at what times of year do fires occur, are fires rising. So this is a very on-the-ground tool that could be used not only by NGOs, but also by journalists who want to cover something really close. We have users from the Nature Conservancy who has used Resource Watch to identify and to assess renewable energy data, mining and agricultural data.
Thanks, Anders. So thank you so much for talking about the overlays and why data is important. So far we've heard from the data journalists, the data creators, and also the data scientists that bring all of this data together. So we've learned that in order to create an impact, we need to ensure that the raw information and other supporting information is in the hands of the right people, oftentimes through journalism and storytelling. So we need to pull insights from raw data and add maybe some contextual data to really show why that is important to enact change. So Samantha, I want to ask you, taking the listening to leaders data, what other data sets are critical towards understanding, why the leaders are making those decisions or what investment decisions are prioritized? What data sets would you use to contextualize the listening to leaders data?
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz, for the question. I think you're absolutely right that the more you can encourage mashup of different data sets to speak to one another, it creates a more complete picture. Some data sets that I think would be useful, so financial data would lend itself very nicely, I think, to intersect with the listening to leaders data. I mentioned before the importance of having the ability to assess rhetoric versus action. So if leaders in these countries say these are their priorities, I'd love to see the public spending data to see if they back that up. Similarly for donors. I think that there's some opportunities to also look at outcome level data. So education was one that was identified as a particularly important priority for leaders. We know that donors are underspending in this area, but what are some of the outputs and the outcomes that we're interested in looking at in terms of improvements in education? So greater literacy, greater enrollment in school. I think that would be a really interesting story as well. I mentioned the benefit of looking at alignment and misalignment between leaders and their citizens, and how responsive are leaders to what their citizens want and otherwise. And then finally, I do think that some of the geo-referenced information that World Resources Institute captures is particularly useful in mashing up with the listening to leaders data, because one of my prevailing, one of the questions that the journalists were asking me and others have asked about, why is environment and climate action so low on the radar for people's priorities? One of my questions was around, well, does it seem too far removed? Does it seem too distant in the future? Does it seem like, oh, this is somebody else's problem and not mine? And so I would be really curious to see if you had information on climate vulnerability, how does that map with people's priorities? So yeah, those are some of my wish list projects to be able to see in future.
Great, thank you, Samantha. So with that, I wanted to have a bit of a prefix before we go into the rest of the demo, where we're showing some of AidData's data and then some of the data sets that Samantha had said are important contextual data. So with that, please take it away, Amelia.
Great, let me just share my screen. All right, can you all see my browser?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So as you heard before, I'm Amelia Snyder, and I'm the data team lead for ResourceWatch. And I'm going to give you a demo of some of the ways that you can use our open data platform as a tool for data storytelling. So as you saw in Samantha's presentation, one of the insights found in the Listening to Leaders survey was that the Sustainable Development Goals related to the environment didn't rank in the top priorities of leaders, even though they're connected to some of those top ranking priorities, such as jobs or food security. So data visualization and analysis could be used by journalists to demonstrate to leaders the urgency of prioritizing environmental issues like these. So we have data related to these topics on ResourceWatch, making it a great place to better understand how countries are doing in each of these areas and if these should be prioritized more. So I'm going to show you some of the ways that you can explore, organize, and share data on our platform. One of the great offerings that we have is our ability to easily create custom dashboards. And these dashboards are a great way to organize data, visualizations, or anything else you might create on our platform and start to build a narrative around them. And the data sets that we host on ResourceWatch are highly curated, making them an ideal starting point for inspiring or supporting stories about the intersections between the environment and human societies. So you can see that I've begun to develop a personal dashboard here around the Listening to Leaders survey results. So what I did on this dashboard is I first wanted to showcase a map of the Listening to Leaders survey results so that I could see how different regions around the world prioritized each of these SDGs related to the environment. And then I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the data that we have related to each of these topics. So starting with SDG Goal 15, which is related to life on land, you can see that I've started here with a chart that shows us how different regions prioritize this SDG according to the Listening to Leaders survey. And then I've also added some maps of data sets related to the targets for this goal. For example, I have maps showing where protected areas around the world exist, and I also have a map showing where deforestation has occurred. So by looking at these new survey results alongside actual data showcasing how protected or how vulnerable land is in different parts of the world, I can start to get a better understanding of which regions might need to place more emphasis on this goal. For SDG Goal 14, which focuses on life underwater, you can see that I've added a few data sets here that can help me get a better understanding of this. I have some data sets on where some major sources of plastic marine pollution are, which coastal ecosystems might be in danger, and which areas of the ocean are being fished the most heavily. Now, I also noticed an interesting connection between these last two data sets, the Ocean Health Index and this fishing data set. I noticed that an area off the coast of West Africa had a low Ocean Health Index here, and that same region was also experiencing high fishing rates. So what I did is I created a map, zoomed into that area, overlaying these two data sets, and I've added this embedded map into my dashboard so that I can come back to this and do a little bit more research on how these two variables might be related. And then finally, for SDG Goal 13, which focuses on climate change, I've included a data set here that showcases how prepared different countries are to adapt to climate change. So for this data set, this climate vulnerability data set that we have, actually, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on this and create some other types of data visualizations here to give you more information about this data set. So you can find this data set in the Resource Watch catalog, as well as these other data sets I've highlighted, by simply typing in a search term that is relevant to what you're interested in. Here I'm looking for climate vulnerability, and you'll see that it pops up right here. And you'll see there's a little star here, and I've actually already bookmarked this data set into a collection here, the Listening to Leaders collection that I've created. So this is a collection of data sets that I thought were relevant to the Listening to Leaders survey that I've put all in one place for me to come back to. And these collections are a great way to organize data sets when you're doing your early exploration of data. And the dashboards are also, as well as the collections, are both completely open and they're free to access. All you have to do to unlock these features is just create a free account on our platform, and then you'll have access to all these great features. So I mentioned that I wanted to go into a deeper dive of this vulnerability to climate change data set. So I'm going to open this data set up in Resource Watch, and I'm actually going to use our custom visualization tool. Got a little reload here. But we're going to use our custom visualization tool to create some other types of visualizations besides just map visualizations. So you can see here it's loading, and there's actually already a visualization that's been created here just to give you an idea of what you can do. I'm going to actually change this, this visualization we have. And what I want to do is I want to find the countries that have the lowest score in this index. Now, what this index tells us is how vulnerable are countries to climate change and how prepared are they to adapt if they're given resources to adapt to climate change, and it combines those two factors. So high scores mean that countries are more able to adapt to climate change, and low scores mean that countries are less able to adapt to climate change. So I want to change this to find the countries with the lowest score of this index. So you can see I already have on my x-axis the country, and I've already selected this index on my y-axis, so that's great. But I want to switch this around to find the low scores here. So I'm going to go into my settings to add some filters to find the information I want. Now you can see there's already a filter added to this, pulling out the 2018 data, which is perfect. That's what I want. I'd like to look at the latest year of data. But what I want to change here is I want to change the order. So I'm going to put it in order of the index here. And I am going to make sure that it's increasing. So we start with the lowest index scores because we're looking for the countries that are least prepared to adapt. And I'll change my limit so I can just focus on the 5 countries at the bottom of the list. And now we can go back to our visualization if I scroll up. And you can see now we've successfully filtered out these countries that we're interested in. So I want to save this visualization to my dashboard so that I can come back to it later and reference it. So I'm going to give it a more descriptive title here. You can see it's been updated, and I'm going to save this widget. It saved it to my visualizations on ResourceWatch, so now I have access to it in my dashboard. So I already have the edit form of my dashboard open, and I'm going to add it in right here. And you can do that simply by searching for the title of the visualization that you want, clicking it, and it easily is added to your dashboard. So now that I've shown you this type of visualization, I actually want to go a little bit more in depth with this. So I'm going to look at how these indices have changed over time for these countries that seem to be least prepared to adapt to climate change. So we'll go back to ResourceWatch and we'll create a new custom visualization. So this time we're going to look at a time series of how this index has changed over time for these countries. So I'm going to change this into a line graph. We offer a variety of types of graphs you can make. On our x-axis, we'd like to plot year, and we'll keep the index value on our y-axis still. Now we want to plot a single line for each country that we're interested in. So I'll color it by the country. You can see this chart doesn't make much sense yet because it's only 2018 data, so let's go fix that as well. So in our settings, let's check out the filters that we have on. As I said, we don't only want 2018, we want to show a time series, so I'll delete this filter. But right now we'll be looking at all the countries in the world, which is just too much information to us to interpret. So I'm going to add a filter that only pulls out those 5 countries that I saw in the last graph. So let me add that filter in now. All right, so now I've successfully filtered these countries. And the last thing I want to think about is my order. I want to make sure that it's put in order of year so that the lines display correctly. And I don't need a limit to my data this time. I want to show the entire time series of data, so I'll put that all the way up. Now we can go back by clicking settings, and we can see the visualization that we've just made. So we can see from this visualization that the countries that are currently the least prepared to adapt to climate change are actually showing a trend of becoming more vulnerable over time. This index has been decreasing over time. So I think this finding is pretty interesting. So I am going to give it a better title that's descriptive of what I just made. And then I'll save this visualization as well so that I can add it to my dashboard. And just with a few clicks, I can add my visualization. And it's just that simple. Now I can save it and my dashboard will be updated. So I hope this demo has given you an idea of the power that ResourceWatch has for data journalists. You can use our data collections to bookmark and organize data sets. You can create map overlays to begin to explore correlations between data sets. You can do deeper dives into analyzing data sets with the custom visualization tool that I showed you. And you can organize all your visualizations and begin to build narrative through dashboards. All of these are highly shareable as well. You can share links to the dashboards you've created through the URL. They'll be publicly accessible with whoever you share this with. Or you can choose to share just a single visualization that you've created through the share button here. And you can see that we provide both a link to access the visualization right in your web browser, as well as an iframe code. If you want to embed this visualization in your website, you can just copy this and add it into your website source code. And it's just that simple to add these visualizations that you create and begin to share them and incorporate them into your workflow and your online resources. So now that I've given you a demo of some of the ways that you can use ResourceWatch to explore data sets, I'd like to turn back to Sarah and ask how we can use data sets and visualizations like these to tell data-driven stories.
Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, I think your demo is really important because our role as journalists in so many ways is to hold power to account and to make sure that politicians, for example, are living up to their promises. So what the graphic and digital representation you just showed says to me, what policy promises have the leaders of those particular countries been making? And have they then fallen flat on them by allowing their countries to become more vulnerable to climate impacts? And, you know, I want to go to some of the particular stories that we worked on in Indonesia, because I think these are pretty representative of all of the things that we've discussed here today, and the points that both Sam and Anders have made. We offered story grants, as I mentioned, to a handful of journalists in Indonesia, and they covered everything from what's driving pollution along one of the longest rivers in Java Island, which is Indonesia's most populous island, to looking at how weather is impacting clove cultivation, to how sea level rise is impacting communities on Java's north coast. And that story in particular was among one of the top 3 rated stories on that media outlet site for a number of days. And I think it's an example of the power these kinds of visualizations have, because they're telling you a story, but that story is grounded in data, which means it's not just about an anecdote. And yet the data absent of the anecdote isn't really a great story either. So what's wonderful about bringing data into stories is that you're bringing all of these pieces together, that you have a human story that is there for grounded in data, which gives it even more emphasis, and vice versa. And so I think you can use those stories to, I guess, hold policymakers to account by saying, this is what's happening in our country, you know, attention needs to be paid to this. And I'll bring up one specific example. I'm going to share my screen because I think this is a really great example of an issue that is on the top of minds of Indonesians because it's a perennial problem there. So this story was produced by a media outlet called AidData, and it looks at forest and land use fires in Indonesia, which, if anyone follows these issues, it's not obviously not just a problem in Indonesia, it's a problem that we're seeing in California and all other parts of the world, Brazil. But this happens over and over again in Indonesia, and it has continued to increase in severity over time. So this reporter who'd worked on this issue for a long time really wanted to dig into it and find out what was happening, why, after the government promising, following particularly bad fires in 2015, things had gotten bad again in 2019. What were they missing? What wasn't being addressed? And what she did was look not just at fires, but the social implications of those fires, particularly around health. And this is such a highly interactive story. So she starts by looking at the number of hot spots. Those are areas where fires were breaking out between 2015 and 2019. And then she goes into looking first at the number of trees that were burned. 1997 was a particularly bad year. And then in subsequent years, the fires weren't quite as bad, but then she looks also at some of the respiratory infections that resulted from these fires. You can see, even though in this year, the fires weren't quite as bad, respiratory infections were worse. She also looks at economic losses and then the amount of carbon released. So again, 2019, not as many trees burned, but there was greater carbon emissions released as a result. You know, and she goes on, and then in part 2 of this story, as you go further down, she tells this very compelling story where she interviews a family who has had the loss of a child because of a respiratory infection. She gets, you know, very personal and makes this story about the human impact of some of these fires. And so I think this is a great example of how data can be brought into a story along with sort of a narrative and an anecdote. And then further on, even better, she looks at some of the policy implications of this. And so she talks about what the government has done, what's been achieved, some of the challenges, what hasn't worked. And again, I think holding power to account, you know, in all these cases, the reporters use the data to more deeply explore the effects of environmental degradation and highlight how communities and local and national governments are responding or perhaps not responding. So I hope that answers your question, but I think data can be really powerful when it's connected to all of these other factors and looks at the implications for what we're seeing in the data.
Sorry. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all of our speakers, Samantha, Anders, and Amelia. We'll conclude our presentation here, and to all of the listeners, please do reach out. All of our contact information is on the site, and we'd be happy to answer any follow-up questions. Thank you again.